here with Dr. Christine Fair, Professor of Security Studies at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Dr. Fair has served in a myriad of roles directly related to our topic, including United Nations Assistance Mission to Afghanistan, the Combating of Terrorism Center at West Point, and the Center for Conflict Analysis and Prevention, and China's role and interests in Afghanistan is what she is going to be talking to us today, because last month, I think the Chinese state-owned Xinjiang Central Asian Petroleum Company signed its first big contract in Afghanistan as part of a sort of return of investment there. So Dr. Christine Fair, give us your analysis.
Give us your analysis.
I'm sorry. I have a really wobbly internet connection. So I'll try to be brief. So I'm really glad that Frederick Garr, by the way, it's really nice to see you. I miss having you in DC, although I didn't seem to actually see you when you were there. I'm glad he raised the fact that China's relationship with the different countries in South Asia, they each need to be considered on their own terms. And I think Afghanistan in particular is one of these. I mean, Frederick said that we weren't talking about China in South Asia 20 years ago, but actually some of us were when it came to Afghanistan, because China had been, on the eve of 9/11, the single most important investor in Afghanistan, right? So China's relationship with Afghanistan actually goes back to the Soviet invasion of the country, when the Chinese, along with the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan, were supporting the so-called Mujahideen to oust the Soviets from Afghanistan. And in fact, in that period of time, the Chinese were quite supportive of their own Uyghur population going and fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan. And this was a decision, like many countries, including the United States, that chose to side in this way, would prove that there'd be very large negative externalities of that policy. Because when those Uyghurs went home, these were Uyghurs that were battle hardened, that had considerable expertise fighting a fairly competent army. And they also were part of this landscape of the jihad that had this narrative that, you know, these scruffy mujahideen were able to hobble a superpower. So this became part of the animating behavior of the Uyghurs in their own quest for separatism from China. By the time we get to circa 1990, China is really realizing the implications of the policies that it had pursued in the previous years. So what we see happening in the middle of the 1990s is that China is trying to figure a way out of the mistakes that it had made. It launches the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which was very much focused upon Islamist terrorism. But it's also when the Chinese really began to figure out its policy with respect to the Taliban. So from the Taliban's point of view, what China was essentially asking them was that they would stop supporting ETIM, or the Uyghur separatists. Now, there's some debate about the extent to which the Taliban did in fact honor those commitments, but the Chinese found what they were getting from the Taliban to be adequately credible, that they were the sole investor in Afghanistan in terms of building what one could at least call the extant, if negligible, telecommunications infrastructure that Afghanistan had. That was compliments of the Chinese. So on the eve of 9/11, China was basically the single most important actor in Afghanistan. And people might actually forget that on the eve of 9/11, China was actually similarly on the brink of signing a memorandum of understanding with Osama bin Laden. So for people of our age, 9/11 doesn't seem like yesterday. I'm aware that some people who might be listening to this were really quite young when 9/11 happened. So I think different participants in this conference are going to have different points of view on this. But I remember being at RAND, where I worked right after 9/11, and the revelation that China was that close to signing a memorandum of agreement with Al-Qaeda was pretty shocking. It was very disquieting. But if you go back and you listen to everything that Osama bin Laden had said up to that point, even beyond, including up to the point where he was killed by Navy SEALs, he never criticized China for what it was doing. And even though China's track record of brutalities, not only against Uyghur Muslims, but other Muslim populations in China was well known, you will not find a single Osama bin Laden take on that, right? So 9/11 happens, and China, quickly reoptimizes its strategy. It throws its support essentially behind what would be the internationally supported government in Afghanistan, but it never stopped supporting the Taliban, right? The Taliban, along with the Pakistanis, continued to argue that the Taliban were important political actors whose equities had to be considered. So China, very early on, going back to 2007, people might recall, it was the single largest investor in Afghanistan with the Ainak copper mine. There were other agreements that were made to, for example, develop the Amu Darya gas basin. And China came under considerable criticism for essentially being a free rider under the US NATO security umbrella. In fact, our former friend and colleague, Steve Cohen, I think very presciently remarked that China will fight to the last US Marine to make Afghanistan, the United States will fight to the last Marine to make Afghanistan exploitable by the Chinese. And I don't think he was entirely wrong. I think what he did do was he overestimated the ability of the Chinese to, in fact, exploit Afghanistan. So with the rise of Xi, of course, China became much more interested in Afghanistan. This is when China really began to effectuate with much more interest the BRI project. And one could have easily seen why Afghanistan would have been a natural player in the BRI. So, for example, if you are looking at the ring or the network of investments that China has made in Pakistan, I'm going to note very briefly, because I presume that Chris might talk about Pakistan in considerable detail. A lot of the focus on CPEC, the Chinese-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or as I prefer to call it, colonizing Pakistan to enrich China corridor, are really focusing on these ground lines of communication to some extent, what has or has not happened in the power sector. But I think what the most important aspect of CPEC is something that gets no attention whatsoever, and that's the agricultural sector. And this is particularly dangerous for a country like Pakistan, which is under so much water pressure. Primarily, the crops that are being grown are intended to feed Chinese, not Pakistani. And while arguably, there are improvements in Pakistan's balance of trade with China through these agricultural deals, in the long term, you're essentially using up a very precious resource in Pakistan, which is water, with no obvious long-term benefit. But if you're looking at CPEC, it becomes immediately obvious why Afghanistan would be potentially important, right? There are about the estimates range between $1 to $3 trillion worth of untapped minerals in Afghanistan, right? So if you could get those minerals out of the ground and onto what was once the ring road and connected that effectively to Gwadar or even to Karachi, this would be, obviously the prospects of this were really quite enticing. And there's very little doubt that to considerable measure, China was hoping that it would be able to exploit those resources in Afghanistan. But what we've seen from the time that the Chinese made those investments up until the Taliban actually took over is that China wasn't able to get any of those minerals out of the ground. And if you consider, even at the height of the surge, when Afghanistan was, arguably, considerably stable to where it fell in more recent years, China wasn't even able to make the slightest impact, even during the height of the US-NATO security umbrella. So now that the Taliban are in charge, China's calculus is very much the same. It's largely been over-promising, for example, the deal that you just noted, but that's by far the only deal that Chinese firms have inked in Afghanistan. I strongly suspect that the biggest obstacle to China's ability to profit from the resources in Afghanistan is going to be the instability that exists in Afghanistan. And if you're looking at the Islamic State, one of the principal ways that the Islamic State Khorasan province, which is to say the Islamic State in Afghanistan, the principal way that it is trying to distinguish itself from the Taliban, because remember, many of the ISKP commanders are themselves former Talibs, and they're basically doing the opposite of whatever the Taliban do. If you look at ISKP publications, as I've done, you see that ISKP, they are leveling their sights very much at the Chinese. So I think Afghanistan is going to be a very, very hard nut for the Chinese to crack. They weren't able to do it at the height of the US security umbrella. They're not going to be able to do it now. The Taliban are not going to be able to provide security. And so I think the Taliban, interestingly enough, they have really reposed a lot of hopes in the Chinese, because if the Chinese could get those resources out of the ground into the market, that would provide a really important source of budgetary support. Looking at Afghan's history, it's going to take about 10 plus years before there's going to be any significant challenge mounted to the Taliban. I would assess even longer than that, because the Northern Alliance has been completely eviscerated. There is no obvious cluster of significant resistance to the Taliban. And having said that, the Islamic State, they will create problems, but they're certainly not proposing an alternative to governance. So I think that while the Taliban are really hopeful that the Chinese are going to deliver, I don't anticipate that China is going to fare much better than it has over the last 20 years in Afghanistan. And that's it. Sorry.
Oh, that's it. Professor Christine Fair, thank you very much. But piques the curiosity also from one of our audience, if I could pitch this question to you, which I think you part answered. It's from Wen Min. Given the scale of instability and the extent of security challenges within Afghanistan, how do the panel, which others can answer this, foresee the viability of China's Belt and Road Initiative in the country in both the medium and long term?
So I, for one, and I'd be interested to hear what Chris and Frederick have to say on this. I, for one, have never really seen this. Well, I'm going to separate this out, right, in a couple of dimensions. So in South Asia, BRI really depends heavily upon CPEC. So if you look at the ground lines of communication aspects of this, you're really talking about road linkages. And what's really going to be important is getting the linkage at the top where Gilgit-Baltistan meets Xinjiang. As a student, I had the opportunity to travel those roads. It's going to take a lot of moving of mountains to make that a viable transport corridor. It's very difficult to get eyes and ears in Gilgit-Baltistan, but whatever we do here coming out of Gilgit-Baltistan has really been one of protest of Chinese efforts. It was, in fact, the Chinese that were pushing very much for Gilgit-Baltistan to become a regularized province. So there's a lot of resistance there. There's a reason why the Pakistanis make it almost impossible to get news, because whatever does come out is not good news for CPEC. And then, of course, the other anchor to CPEC is Gwadar, which is in Balochistan. And if there's an organization more than the Islamic State that hates China more, it's probably the various Baloch organizations that have been resisting Chinese efforts there for a really long time. Gwadar is, by all accounts, pretty much in firm Chinese control. But this raises the question, I think Andrew Small would have been great for this panel, but I remember reading a very interesting statistic from his book some years ago And that is that to move a barrel of oil through this posited G-lock from Xinjiang to Gwadar is 4 times more expensive than the most expensive internal G-lock that China has. And I very much agree with Andrew. I don't see this CPEC G-lock as being an economically viable one. I do think it's a strategic corridor. And so if this really were an economic corridor, I think we would see a lot more vigorous interest in China, Chinese interest in Afghanistan, because that's where a lot of the money remains to be tapped. And if you actually look at the amount of money, for example, that China gave to Afghanistan after the earthquake and after the massive humanitarian crisis that followed the Taliban takeover, it was like 30 million. And the Americans, despite the sanction against the Taliban, ponied up nearly 800 million. So if we actually look at what China does in the scale of what other actors are doing, I don't wake up every night thinking that we all are going to have to learn Mandarin. I'm much more worried about Pakistanis having their groundwater further depleted by growing resources, including controversial resources like pork farming, and really diminishing Pakistan's ability to take care of its own citizens. That's what worries me at night, is not, and I will also say that CPEC is the gift that keeps on giving. Every once in a while, these videos will surface of Chinese engineers very frustrated that they can't meet their hookers, and you'll find Chinese jumping up and down on the hoods of Pakistani police vehicles who are trying to protect them from, getting whacked. But instead, the Chinese contractors are much more interested in their hookers than they are their safety.
Can I just, and I'd like the other panel to think about this again, but can I put this to you, Christine, because you mentioned the memorandum of understanding that was almost to be signed with bin Laden. And now we've got similar stuff going on with Russia and other people, which gives a sort of Chinese view of how it operates in our morality sense, as it were, from Western democracies, from bin Laden to Putin and so on. A questioner who Planet Earth Calling, they name themselves. What implication does the Chinese overtures have for democracy in the developing world? Could you give us a nutshell thought on that?
I'll give you a nutshell. So first of all, I don't think the West has been a very good custodian of this planet. I also see that all of our supply chains are vertically integrated with China. Our ability to separate ourselves out from China is all but difficult. We've learned very little, if any, very few, if any, lessons from Corona, right? We still have our medicinal supply chain very directly linked into China. And I will say that as an American in particular, the fact that we have a Republican Party that actually believes that any green investments mandated by the government somehow will interfere and deprive American individual liberties to make profits to be very, very disturbing. So I don't think that if China were to become the custodian of the world, this is obviously not a world I wish to live in. But I also want to be clear that I think as an American, I'm very critical of what my country has done. I mean, I look at the invasion of Iraq on grounds that are still completely mystifying. We destroyed a country. We gave birth to ISIS. While you cannot draw a direct line from the Mujahideen to Al-Qaeda, I think had the Americans, and certainly Pakistan began its own jihad strategy in '74, I think we could make the argument that had the United States, China, Saudi, Pakistan not involved itself as it did in Afghanistan, there would not have been an Al-Qaeda. So while I certainly think that a world under Chinese custodianship that is a nightmare for me. I can also be very critical that under American stewardship, it hasn't turned out to be that great either.